So in this video, we're going to be looking at the history of philosophy. We're going to be looking at some of the great philosophers and what some of their ideas were and how they shaped the world we live in today. Two of my favourite philosophers who have had the most influence on me are Socrates, one of the ancient Greeks, and Descartes, who was a French philosopher. Socrates taught that we ought to question everything. He would always ask why. And he used to really irritate a lot of the people who thought that they were very intelligent. His famous thing was that he would present himself as the fool and ask these questions. And these people who were very high and mighty and really thought themselves to be very clever, sooner or later came to the realization that actually they didn't really know what they were talking about or why they really thought what they thought. Because scratching the surface and actually questioning their beliefs, once it got past a certain point, they started to get annoyed because they realised that actually they didn't know what they were talking about. And this ties in with what Descartes said. He said, "I think, therefore I am." So he said this in the context of saying that how do we prove that life is real? How do we prove that I exist, that you exist, etc., etc.? He said, "I think, therefore I am." If I'm thinking, it means that there must be something that is thinking. And therefore, that's how one can prove one's own existence. We're thinking, therefore we are. And he also really promoted question everything and getting people to question not just other people, but their own views, their own beliefs. One arrives at a point of intellectual honesty at the point at which one questions every one of one's own beliefs and can really justify why one thinks that. That is the beauty of philosophy. So we're just going to go straight now into some of the history of philosophy. So we're actually going to start off the history of philosophy, not with the ancient Greeks, but we're going to start off with some of the ancient Eastern philosophies. So a major influence on me also has been Tao, and the religion known as Taoism stems from this belief. So Tao said that, to put it very simply, one ought to go with the flow. Just like a river doesn't go through a rock, one should go around the rock. In life, when we come across difficulties, when we're dealing with difficult people, difficult situations, it's not a thing of just completely avoiding those situations, but finding the way of going around them, finding the path of least resistance, and so essentially go with the flow. Confucius took a very different approach. Confucius was an ancient Chinese philosopher as well, but his belief was that society ought to be very well ordered and very well structured, all the way from the state, where you have an emperor, and then you have people below him, and you have people below them, and they're all in a very neat structure where people at the top owe something to the people below them, and people below them have to follow orders of the people above them. And this takes it down even to the family level, where a good father is someone who instructs their son or daughter, and similarly, the son or daughter must look up at the father or the mother. Well, obviously, in those times they were very patriarchal and stuff, but the wider context of it is one ought to look up to people who are above you, but also the people who are above you have a certain duty of care towards you. And then finally, we're going to look at Buddha, the founder of Buddhism. He believed that all life is suffering, and that it's only by getting rid of all of our things, all the things that tie us down in life, all the things like from material things, family, etc., etc., all the problems that are in life, we have to give them up. And that is the only way we can reach nirvana, i.e. enlightenment. It's the only way we can transcend our physical bodies. It's the only way we can leave the suffering of the world behind and go on to something higher. So that's a look at some of the Eastern philosophers from ancient times. Next, we're going to look at the Western philosophers. So as I already mentioned, we have Socrates, who had his Socratic method of constantly questioning people. You had Plato, who believed, again, in a very, in a society that was very structured and run essentially by what he referred to as philosopher kings. So these were going to be the wisest, best people to rule a nation. And these are the people who would rule through virtue, and that's how they would govern society. Society would be run by the very best people. So it's very, as it were, technocratic analysis of how the world ought to be run. Next, you had Aristotle, who was, a student of Plato and helped put together some of his works. And Aristotle, again, looked into many different things. His views on democracy, his views on the nature of government and how things should be run. All very, very interesting things that we don't have time to go through within this video. As with all of these philosophers, I'd really encourage you to do your own research and to look a lot deeper into all their things. And one could also even say that Jesus Christ was a philosopher of sorts. His preachings up on the Mount, to the extent that, obviously some people will be like, oh, Jesus wasn't real. To the extent that one can look at him as a historic figure as well as a religious figure, because obviously Christians believe him to be the Son of God. His philosophy of love thy neighbour, turn the other cheek, of help those who are less fortunate to you, etc., etc. All of these tied up with the other things from the Abrahamic religions, all the way from Moses and Abraham, etc., etc. The stories within the Bible, stories within the ancient Greek gods and ancient Roman gods, all of these stories as well were, again, people at the time wouldn't have thought of it as philosophy, but there's a certain philosophical underpinning of how to live a good life and how society ought to be structured. Next, we're going to skip forward a few centuries, or millennia even, and we're going to start looking at some people who were pre-Enlightenment and Enlightenment thinkers. So we'll start in this section by looking at some of the English philosophers, starting with Hobbes. So Hobbes' view of nature, as I alluded to in the previous video, was that life is short, nasty, and brutish. I think I've got it in the wrong order. But the point being that in a state of nature, there's basically anarchy and everyone is just out for themselves. And so Hobbes said that we needed a strong king, we needed like a Leviathan, to basically structure society in a way where it'd be top down and where everyone would have their place and everyone would submit to the authority of the king. John Locke, who came a little bit afterwards, had a very different view. Locke can kind of be seen as one of the first thinkers of liberal thought, and again we'll get into that in future videos in more depth. But the main thing with Locke was the view of how society ought to be structured, not from the top down, but from the bottom up. And so his famous thing of life, liberty, and property, which is where the American founding fathers got their thing from, for life, liberty, and pursuit of happiness. But that's complicated. We'll get into why they changed that in another video. But those views end up influencing a lot of thinking throughout the English-speaking world, and the knock-on effect of that ended up leading to the American War for Independence, the American Revolution, whichever you'd like to call it. And so America was largely founded upon Lockean principles, and obviously they had huge influence here in Britain as well, and spread to the rest of the world. people like John Mill, who came a century or so afterwards, also espoused many of these same liberal values. So in his book On Liberty, he talks about all these different things, and you also had people like Thomas Paine, who was a really fundamental person in arguing for American independence. All of it tied up within this view of how society should be bottom up and how it should be run to give people the maximum amount of freedom that's possible within a legal structure. Because, as the great ancient Greeks said, without law there can be no liberty. So in a state of complete anarchy where there's no law and order, you can't really have freedom at all. Right? So this is some of the things that a lot of the English philosophers really focused on. In France, by contrast, the philosophers tended to have a very different approach, and that came from a very different view of society. So as I alluded to in the last video, where Hobbes has a view of human nature being, incredibly bad, Rousseau had the view that, as he said, man is born free but everywhere in chains. So his view was that society could be perfected if only the rotten institutions that we currently have were done away with, whether that be religion, etc., etc. So, and a lot of Rousseau's thought ended up leading to the French Revolution and how that turned out. So if one contrasts the American Revolution and the French Revolution, one can see how these two competing views end up having very, very different consequences. And another person to speak about who came from France, who's very notable, as I said before about Descartes, who came pre-Rousseau, kind of pre-Enlightenment. Another person was Montesquieu, and he's famous for coming up with the idea of separation of powers, right? So in America, when he did his tour of America, he noted how liberty could be maintained and secured because in America you have the executive, so you have the president, you have the Congress, which is the legislature, and you have the judiciary, which is the Supreme Court. And keeping those completely separate, unlike in the British system, and all the other kind of systems up here, ends up keeping the thing, ends up securing liberty, because too much power is never concentrated in one particular place. That is a view. At the same time, Britain, which has a whole lot of overlap between the executive and the legislature and the judiciary, still able to maintain its liberty throughout these times. So it's there's questions, as with all of these things, there's debates and there's questions about it, right? So one just has to read the stuff for yourself and take your own view on it. And finally, we're going to be looking at Nietzsche, one of the German philosophers. So Nietzsche had the idea of what's known as the Übermensch, or Superman in rough translation. And he compared this and contrasted this to what he referred to as the last man. So one of the famous lines from Nietzsche is, "God is dead." And that's been taken by many people as a kind of triumphant statement. That's been taken as him celebrating that. Actually, it is a thing of he was before his time, and he could see the slow collapsing of religion in the Western world. And it's the first time in any society at any time that atheism was becoming a thing, right? And every society before had always looked at a higher power and constructed their worldview around that. So he said, right, if and that's why people always forget out the last bit that he said, which is, God is dead and we have killed him. So he said it in a very mournful way. So to try and get around that, to try and build something to fill that vacuum. He posited that human beings, in a sense, would have to almost become God. So that's basically what the Ubermensch would be. So it doesn't mean that they'd have a cape and that they start flying around. It's not that kind of Superman. But it's a thing of human beings would transcend their flaws and their inadequacies and become like higher beings and stuff. And, you know, we live up to our full potential, as opposed to the last man, who can basically be described as a kind of licentious kind of person, someone who just focuses on purely like earthly pleasures, you know, sex, drug, rock and roll, all that kind of stuff, and someone who doesn't really think for the future, just very much lives in the moment, and doesn't have any higher ideals or higher values and stuff. And unfortunately, you can see quite a lot of that today. So Nietzsche tried to basically come up with not a new religion, but something to fill the void that that the collapse of religion was starting to create. And the next person we're going to be talking about, who's also German, is Hegel, who's a little bit before Nietzsche. Now, Hegel posited that that even though people from the past or people that we completely disagree with may have very different values from us, we can still learn things from that. And that's something that he called dialectic, right? So human beings have not really, on a biological level, changed much since we were first evolved 200,000 years ago, right? So when people look at people in the past and think, oh, look at them, they're so stupid and they've got such bad values and etc., etc., it's a thing of, if you yourself were born in, say, 1000 BC or 1392 or whatever, your values would not, you wouldn't be the person that you are right now. Yeah, chances are you would be like everyone else, in society, right? You wouldn't have the same knowledge that you have now. You wouldn't have the same access to technology. You wouldn't have the same access to learning, etc., etc. So to look at people in the past and look down on them, or to look at people who have different views from you and to look down on them, is quite arrogant, and also it misses out many of the things that they have that you don't have, and so if we were having a dialectic dialogue as such, what two people would come out with is the thing of, right, I agree with some of the things that you're saying, and you're agreeing with some of the things that I'm saying. And we might not agree on everything, but somewhere in the middle we can find some sort of common ground, consensus, right? And this is the same with, you know, politics and things. There's this thing of and with philosophy and economics, etc., etc. There are many things that I will disagree with people on. I'll respectfully disagree with them on, and I say, you know what, I like X, Y, and Z about what you believe in, and they'll say, and hopefully they say the same thing, and together we can come together and build some sort of consensus, some sort of thing. Like, doesn't mean abandoning our values. It just means coming together where there's common agreement and trying to build something in that regard.